Games have been improving the way they look for a very long time now, but that all comes at a cost. This is Cyberpunk 2077, which is now a 5-year-old game, believe it or not, running at 1440p max settings at 25 FPS on an $800 graphics card. Let's take a new game, for example, Black Myth Wukong, running at its max settings, getting 23 FPS. And I chose those two games to highlight one thing, and that is path tracing. If you don't know what path tracing is, according to NVIDIA, it's a physics-based equation for describing the way light moves around a scene, and the use of Monte Carlo simulation to help choose a manageable number of paths back to a light source. Kajaya outlined the fundamental techniques that would become the standard for generating photorealistic computer-generated images. And you may be saying, that sounds a lot like ray tracing.
We don't care. Let me tell you, we don't care.
Well, that's because path tracing is another form, I think, of ray tracing. It just traces more rays. Yeah. To sum up what path tracing even is, it's basically a harder to run but more realistic looking version of ray tracing. And ray tracing is already a very difficult thing to run. Normally, that didn't mean you had to use it, right? According to the Steam hardware survey, the most used graphics card right now is the NVIDIA RTX 3060 at 5.88%. But it's then followed by the 4060 laptop and desktop, and then in fourth place it is the GTX 1650 from NVIDIA. If you don't know what the GTX branding is, that is NVIDIA's brand for Giga Texel Shader Extreme. And they have their RTX branding, which is also from NVIDIA, is their Ray Tracing Textural Extreme line. If your card is a GTX GPU, they do not support hardware ray tracing. Like, they literally just don't do it. And this really wasn't an issue until a certain game called Indiana Jones came out and requires ray tracing as a minimum requirement. So if you have, let's say, that 1650 or anything in the 10 series or below, even the 1080 Ti, which according to Tech Power Up is actually 10% faster than a 3060, they won't even open the game. And this is just the beginning. The upcoming Doom game is also the second ever game to release to have ray tracing as a minimum requirement. Now, I know the 10 series and just the GTX graphics cards in general are pretty old now, and a lot of people are currently using them, but maybe it's time for them to upgrade. That leads me into one reason why I wanted to make this video.
GTX 5070, 4090 performance at 549.
Now, that doesn't seem like a bad thing until you play literally the next 5 seconds of this clip.
Impossible without artificial intelligence.
What?
What does that even mean? NVIDIA started using AI to improve game performance in February of 2019 with the introduction of deep learning supersampling, or DLSS. DLSS upscaling renders your game at a lower resolution and then uses AI to upscale back to your set resolution. In the beginning, it was realistically pretty bad looking, but now, for most people, you won't even be able to tell. I can barely even tell sometimes. I'll show you a test in God of War Ragnarok. One is a native 1440p with no upscaling, and the other is DLSS quality at 1440p, which renders the game at 960p and then upscales it to a 1440p like image. I'll give you 5 seconds. The video on the left is upscaled and the picture on the right is native resolution. And you may be wondering, why even upscale in the first place if it's realistically isn't perfect? Well, just look at my FPS difference. Let's go back to Cyberpunk. Before, I was getting around 30 FPS, and now with DLSS quality, I'm getting around 55 to 60 FPS. And for me, I personally like upscaling, but only for scenarios like this where I'm using an experimental feature in a game that just doesn't work without upscaling. When it gets bad is when a game is built on the basis of upscaling. Unreal Engine 5 is mainly what I'm talking about. Don't get me wrong, Unreal Engine 5 games look really, really good. Some of the best looking games, but not good enough to demand their performance. Another comparison is, let's say, Red Dead Redemption 2 at max settings versus Black Myth Wukong at 1440p max settings without path tracing. We have Black Myth Wukong running at around 40 to 50 FPS, and then we have Red Dead Redemption 2 running at nearly double the FPS sometimes. Does Black Myth Wukong look twice as good to justify the performance difference? No. And Black Myth Wukong isn't even the worst optimized UE5 game. Games like Stalker 2, Ark Ascended, and some others that I don't really remember off the top of my head look and even run worse. And speaking of Ark, as far as I know, it is the only game right now to force the use of frame generation. And frame gen is also another big reason why I wanted to make this video. As you saw in the clip earlier in the video, Nvidia's CEO claimed that the RTX 5070 will be as fast as the 4090 for $550. The 4090 was the previous gen's flagship at, say, $1,600 MSRP. But he also said 5 seconds later that this would be
impossible without artificial intelligence.
And the AI he's specifically talking about here is multi-frame generation. But before I go into multi-frame gen, I want to break down what just regular frame generation even is. Frame generation was first released with the RTX 4000 series, and the way it works is whenever you render a frame in a game, frame gen will delay showing you the second frame and instead certain AI generated frame in between the two frames, effectively doubling your frame rate. Unlike DLSS upscaling, DLSS frame gen does not render the game at a lower resolution, so in my opinion it can look sharper. I will show you in a couple of games. Here we have Ghost of Tsushima at around 80ish FPS at 1440p max settings. If I turn frame gen on, we are getting up to 140 FPS. Next we have Forza Horizon 5 at 1440p max settings, already getting 140 FPS, and turning on frame gen will get us all the way up to 200 FPS. And finally we have God of War Ragnarok, just like before, 1440p max settings, getting around 100 to 120 FPS, and with frame gen I'm getting about 160 to 170 FPS. And you may be thinking, well, what's even the catch? Well, in those games, I'm gonna be honest, I can't really tell a difference. Frame gen works a lot better when your base frame rate is a lot higher. Let's say a game like Wukong, I won't even get into the FPS because it's pretty bad. I will just talk about the visual artifacts that you get from frame gen. If you look over in the bottom right where your abilities section is, whenever you hold it out, like if you were going to use an ability and you turn your camera around, you have some major artifacting in the abilities section if you choose to use frame gen. And there are tons of other cases of frame gen causing artifacting and other visual issues, but that's not the only issue with frame gen. Frame generation really should be called a frame smoothing technology, because when you increase your FPS natively or just actually rendering out those frames, you are lowering your system's latency, which means it feels more responsive, it feels faster. But when you use frame generation, you are actually lowering your latency in most cases, not by a lot, but you are basically getting either lower or the same response times that you would be getting from the base frame rate you started using frame generation onto. But what's new with the 50 series, frame gen can essentially just generate more frames. Now instead of the regular 2x mode, there is a 3x and even 4x frame generation mode. So say you use the 4x frame gen mode, for every one rendered frame, you get 3 AI generated frames, meaning 75% of the frames you see are not even rendered with your graphics card. And this is obviously where Nvidia gets their fast as a 4090 claim. Newsflash, the 5080 without using frame gen isn't even as fast as the 4090, and the 5090 is only about 30% faster than a 5090, with costing $400 more. So that whole claim is obviously just some marketing BS. But if I'm being honest, I personally don't have a problem with any of these technologies. I think they are all really cool, and I haven't even talked about all of them in this video. And for me, they work relatively well. But I have to be honest, I'm not the average player. If I plugged in my 3060, I would be seeing a completely different story. And that's the problem. Not everybody can play games like me or like other people with high-end systems. Most people are getting lower frame rates. So when Nvidia, AMD, whoever are adding these new features, it doesn't really help those people. It really just makes their games look worse. Now game devs just rely on the fact that instead of using these technologies as an option, these game devs are using them as a basic necessity, a requirement just to even play their game. And I think now more than ever is marking the time where game optimization is just skyrocketing, just in the wrong direction. When game devs like Wildcard force the use of something like frame generation to cover up their laziness is where we start to have problems, and this is unfortunately just the beginning of games being unoptimized and patched up with the help of AI. But that's all I have for today's video. I know it's a very different topic, but I thought it would be fun to do a video on two of my favorite things, PCs and video games. So I hope you guys all enjoyed. Have a great day. Peace.